There she is. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the March 17th daily edition of the Scientific Governance and Risk meeting. This is the second in hopefully brief series of calls we'll be having on a daily basis to discuss the rapid emergence of a bunch of measures that the Maker governance ecosystem is taking to combat market instability recently. We found, well, it comes as no surprise, we all know this, the ecosystem can move rapidly. 1 year in crypto is 10 years into the traditional world. The traditional world has seemed to have adopted that same philosophy, so real world's moving at a fast clip and we have to move even faster. We have an open governance system that requires consensus and decision-making as a group and signaling, but it also requires a certain level of agility to get things done. And so these calls are going to be an experiment, a real-time, live and recorded experiment of how does governance happen in real time when the markets are frothy and we need to react to situations and respond to them appropriately without giving up our principles and our processes, procedures and policies. So this is part of a learning experience. This is going to be a tough teaching moment for all of us, a teaching moment for the ecosystem as well. The point is, at the very end of this thing, I hope that we've learned a lot of really important lessons, and these are going to be the calls where we walk through those lessons and then we record them from posterity. Today we have a lot of domain experts on the call, so I'm not going to do my usual philosophizing. Vamsi is going to be giving us a presentation about flop auctions and walking through some of the technical aspects of that might have been missed. We're going to talk about whether the flop auction mechanism needs to be tweaked. This is going to be another theme that I want people to internalize over the course of the next week, is that the ecosystem, the community, the governance moved rapidly over the course of the last 4 or 5 days. But the things that we've done were to stabilize the system and shore it up in the face of adversity. None of this is permanent. We've seen, obviously, historically, that our governance, our protocol evolves rapidly, and it's nothing is permanent. So we have the coming weeks and months to review and refine and potentially redact. I don't know, that's not the right word, but it starts with an R, so I'll go with it. The things that happened over the course of the last week. And so this also look forward as much as we possibly can while we're in the middle of things. I know that can be a challenge. Marc Andre is going to talk to us about auction keepers, how to get those things fired up and putting them in a Docker container, which I will be paying very close attention to. The frothiness has raised a bunch of other issues that, well, actually, that's probably going to be one of the major themes when it comes time in the next few days or weeks to do postmortems and look back to what actually happened. But we've accelerated as a group lots of ideas, lots of plans that we've had from the very beginning. USDC is obviously one of those, but a plan that we've been talking about for since the day that MCD launches was what are we going to do with SCD and when does that shut down? And this is going to be a question that becomes far more urgent as the ecosystem becomes murkier. So we need to talk about SCD shutdown. We're going to talk about what thresholds and metrics and what data we need to have available to us in order to make an informed decision as an ecosystem. We're going to have a chat about the USDC edition, what that means, what the parameters implied, what benefits that brings to our protocol, what risks it brings as well. And then we're going to talk about the circuit breaker. This is going to be another very popular topic in the ecosystem over the coming months, or weeks or months. I'm willing to predict what the flavor of a month ago, 2 months ago, were flash loans, that the new flavor is going to be circuit breakers. We need to, as an ecosystem, understand how to put some checks in place, because we've all built out this pleasingly adversarial game theoretic economy that is designed to reward the strong and weed out the weak. Let's make sure that we're not the weak. And so making sure that we have adequate defenses in place is going to be a a topic for many players in the DeFi space, and circuit breakers are going to be one of those. I think I am going to stop there. We don't have an order of operations here in the call today, and so it's primarily going to be a risk and smart contracts led discussion. So maybe Cyrus, you're kind of the hero. What is it? The hero we didn't deserve, but we got anyways, or the hero we need. But one of those things. So Cyrus, as the risk team, head of the risk department, you want to give us a heads up of which one you think we should dig into first?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I structured the agenda in a way that I thought made sense, because I know there's a lot of people interested in the flop auction, and because that's such a that's coming in 2 days, right? So it's very short-term thing. So I think that should be taken care of. After that, I think we can jump into any order. I think the USDC and circuit breaker discussion are kind of actually the big ones. So it's one, to make sure that the discussing SCD and auction keepers wasn't forgotten about. So I kind of sandwiched those in the middle for what it's worth.
All right. Sounds good to me. So Vamsi, that means that you're up. Do you have a presentation ready for us?
Yep.
Okay, while we're waiting for Vamsi to get this thing kicked off, I would want to do some of the boilerplate that I usually do in these calls for new viewers. If you have questions, please feel free to get onto a microphone and ask those questions. We are comfortable with interruptions. If you don't have access to a microphone, please type your chat in the sidebar, and David or one of the other people in the call will identify those questions, and then we'll read them out, and then we'll have somebody answer them for you. I want to actually ask. There's a lot of things going on. There's going to be a lot of discussion. So let's try to minimize, I guess, having 2 or 3 sub calls going on in the chat that are unrelated to the thing that people are actively talking about. So if there's interesting things happening in the chat, please bring them to the attention of the call, because these chats don't traditionally make it into the historical record. And I would like for this all to be recorded for posterity. So if there's an interesting conversation happening, please consider bringing it to the attention of everybody else. All right, Vamsi, are you ready to go?
I think I'm ready. My desktop sharing is working.
Yeah, we could see your screen.
Yeah, sorry about that. Hey, everyone. So I'll just take, I think, like a quick 10-15 minutes, and then just set a little bit of context, and then go over the exact auction mechanism that that we'll use for debt auctions. That just took I pulled these about 5-10 minutes back. So this is the current state of the system. You might have heard about the number 5 million in bad debt being thrown around. That number is not stored anywhere. How we end up at that number is that we have about 18 million in system debt, and the system also has a surplus about 1 million. As you know, not every single vault had a low bid. So the system collected, did some auctions collateral auctions pretty efficiently. Also collected a lot of liquidation penalties on those. So we did end up with a significant surplus too. So the entire system debt, we all know, is in a blocked state, and it'll unblock sometime early Thursday Eastern time, which is when it'll start getting processed. I don't think I need to touch upon how vaults are liquidated. We all know that during a normal liquidation, when competitive bids come in, both keepers are able to put in buy collateral at a discount, but still leave collateral for vault owners to withdraw after. we've seen that this did not happen. What happened was when a vault got liquidated, both the debt as well as the collateral got seized by the Maker protocol, and it got transferred. The debt got transferred to the system, so which is the number that we see in system debt. The collateral got transferred to a collateral auction, and because those collateral auctions ended up with like very low bids, the entire collateral got transferred to those servers in return for a very little DAI, or almost like no DAI. That meant the debt queue, or the system debt increased, but the system did not see the surplus levels also increase at the same rate, which is why we are in this situation. Basically, again, we have an amount of like debt that is blocked, which will start to get processed pretty soon. I think we're also aware of all the governance changes that happened, so I won't be touching upon these. The key thing here is specific to debt auctions. Previously, we had a bid duration of like 10 minutes, so that got changed to 6 hours. The auction expiry itself stays at 3 days, so that did not change. That did change for collateral auctions, but it did not change for debt auctions. So bids are like 6 hours, and the entire auction like can last for like 3 days. There are like 2 distinct steps. So the first step is debt processing, and this can be done by governance participants, need not be done by those participating in debt auctions. And once this debt is processed, debt auctions can be kicked off. Before we get into debt processing, we need to understand how these numbers are stored in the system. So a quick recap of that. Whenever you want to understand the total system debt number, you'd have to find out the asset balance, specifically the SYN asset balance of the WO contract address. So let me explain that a little bit. So just like how DAI exists in the system, we have another asset called SYN. And although it's not available as an ERC20, it's used by the system to keep track of debt that it or any address holds. The only address that holds this asset balance today is the liquidation module WO. So if you look up inside the VAT contract, if you look up the WO contract address, and if you look up the SYN balance of that address, you can always find out total system debt. This is the total system debt number. It doesn't tell us how much of it is blocked and how much of it is unblocked, ready to be processed. So every time a vault gets liquidated, what happens is a second variable, like 2 other variables are also updated. So one is capital SYN, capital SIN. It's a variable inside the liquidation module, and like that gets updated, and that tracks the total block system debt. And this is like how debt enters the system. There is also a mapping called small s SYN, and what this does is every block, the total debt that got total system debt, that's the total of all the vaults that got liquidated in that block. That amount of debt gets attached with a timestamp and is stored in a queue. So when we talk about debt processing, what happens is as and when the wait delay expires for each one of those chunks, it starts to get unblocked, and it can be dealt with through 2 mechanisms, which I'll explain shortly. So as we know, governance updated the wait delay to 6.5 days, and the flog function is will start removing each chunk of like block debt from the queue as and when in their 6.5 days of wait time lapses. When it comes to unblocked debt, this is like crucial, right? This is how we find out how much needs to be processed through a debt auction. This is not a stored number. So you'd always have to calculate this. Excuse me. You'll always have to calculate this number by looking at the total system debt and looking at the remaining blocked debt amount in the system. So once you like subtract these 2 numbers, you get the unblocked debt. And if some amount of debt is being under debt auctions, there's another variable that is called ash. So let's say a governance keeper has executed flog, removed some of the blocked debt from the queue and moved it to the unblocked state. So you still can't kick off a debt auction because the system also has a surplus and DAI. So what first needs to happen is that the like again, governance or anyone can execute the heal function and can cancel out equal amounts of surplus and unblocked debt. So that's the first step. The surplus has to go to 0 before it can be this unblocked debt can be dealt with. So he'll like right now would cancel about the 13 million in surplus that we currently have, and it'll put it at a state where like there's no more unblocked debt and there's no more surplus. Now, when Flog continues to remove more blocked debt, then we'll hit a threshold. I think it's 50,000 DAI. And then once this threshold, once there's at least 50,000 DAI in unblocked debt, no surplus in the system to cancel that, then a debt auction can be kicked off. A debt auction is again, the system tries to mint and sell MKR for DAI, and the received DAI is used as surplus to cancel out any like system debt. Debt under auction is recorded as in the variable ash, and then once debt auctions like bring in some surplus, another function called KISS can only like cancel ash with that surplus. So when the debt auctions are running and ash is positive, like KISS takes care of like canceling using the surplus and canceling out. And then once this is done, once all the debt auctions are done, the system just goes back to equilibrium without no system debt, no system surplus. What happens so that was the stage, and then like once a debt auction is kicked off, like I said, the amount is recorded by increasing the variable hash. Like when we usually think about an auction, we think about like bids, right? And bids increasing. Here it's slightly different. The bid always stays constant. So it's always going to be 50,000 DAI. I mean, unless this number changes this week. So as a bidder only can bid like 50,000 DAI, cannot bid any other amount. The auction itself, when it kicks off, like starts off with these numbers, where the initial MKR amount offered by the auction is 250, and it requests like 50,000 DAI. So the first bid, if a first bid comes through, the 50,000 DAI is immediately sent to the surplus, and that can like cancel out the system debt while the auction still continues. And other participants can choose to reduce the MKR amount that they request. So they do that by lowering the MKR lot size, and they can lower it by 3% every time. So the second bidder will reduce it by 3% to 42.5 and so on. And every time that's done, like extends for another 6 hours until 3 days, assuming at some point like the bids would stop. If the bids stop before 3 days, the auction ends. The last bidder gets the MKR. If no bids come for the first 3 days, which is the auction expiry, then a function called tick can be executed, and tick resets the auction. The number 240 is wrong. It's 250 increased by 20%. And it sets the initial MKR offered to a higher number, and for the same 50,000 DAI. This increase would continue every 3 days until at least one bid comes through for 50,000 DAI. So approximately, since we have,
sorry, Vamsi, can I interrupt for 1 second?
5 million DAI in system debt, that would be about, yeah.
I think on the last slide, was that a typo? The increase the lot size by 20%. It should be increased to 300.
Yeah, that's a.
Yeah, he mentioned there was a
Yeah,
typo.
yeah,
Yeah.
this is wrong. So yeah.
No worries. Just wanted to just make sure nobody else is confused.
Yeah, it starts off at 250, and if it gets reinitialized with tick, then the next auction would be at 300.
No, the lot size is 200, I think.
200.
The
Oh,
price,
sorry. Yeah.
No, I think the lot size is 250.
it's 250,
it translates
that's
into a
true.
price of 200.
200 is the price, the resulting initial price. That's true.
Damn it, Gonzalo.
On this topic, that's the initial lot size is the vow dump, and the bid size is vow sump. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
And those parameters are just directly set via governance. So if they were going to change, it would be like an executive vote. Great.
Yeah, I think my Zoom crashed and back, but that was the end of my presentation. So
The last slide was the numbers slide?
yeah,
With those 3 bullet points?
I wanted to mention 2 points there. When bidders need not worry about that. As long as the
Wait,
time
you cut
of
out
the bid
Vamsi.
elapses, nobody can.
You cut out Vamsi. Can you just repeat what you just meant to say?
Yeah, couple points that I just wanted to make were, like, submitting deal finalizes the bid and gives the debt auction participant the MKR, but nobody can, after either like after the auction expires, either the bid is bid expiry or auction expiry, nobody can sneak in another bid before deal is executed. So as long as the time is done, like the last bidder would get would win the bid. And these are not sequential, so all these auctions will more or less be kicked off parallelly as and when debt gets unblocked in the system.
So initially you had in the slide approximately 100 debt auctions will open almost parallel.
Yes, yeah.
All right, thanks, MC. There's a lot to absorb in there, and I think that there's some good questions in the sidebar. One of them primarily, or a comment at least. I'm not sure that at least I personally think in text and numbers as well as you do, MC. So maybe if we could get some flows of at some point in the future of how value is moving through the system and where the breakpoints are and all the rest, that would be super useful. But thanks for the presentation, Cyrus. I'm going to actually hand it off to you to be the MC on this, because
Sure.
As you pointed out, it is your agenda and it's your world we're living in right now. So,
Cyrus, any objections that I present my talk about auction keepers next?
No, if you have kind of a time conflict or something.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, let's do that. And then afterwards, we'll talk about the mechanics of the starting bid for the flop.
Okay, good. So Vamsi presented what happens with the flop. I'll just go over a very quick presentation of what an auction keeper is and what the role an auction keeper does in the ecosystem for a flip, a flap, and a flop that we just mentioned that we'll keep talking about today. So I think auction keepers they're not new, but a lot of people were not paying attention until last Thursday. So I'll just explain that an auction keeper is a piece of software that participate automatically to all Meter protocol auctions. So the flip for basically liquidating the vaults, the flap to acquire and burn system surplus and burn MKR, and the flop where we mint MKR to cover for system debt. So a auction keeper will launch the auction, it will bid onto the auction. So there's the DENT and TENT names that we're getting familiar with, and it will eventually finalize the auction in a deal. So if you want to run your own auction keeper, well, the Maker Foundation made software to make this possible, to make it easier. I've put in the presentation links for an auction keeper software, which is a Python software that runs a keeper. Unfortunately, the software doesn't work out of the box. You need to get a few pieces in until it works. So that's why in the past few days, we've had people working on a Dockerized auction keeper. I think Kenton that is on the call that cannot speak. I think he's busy right now, but he's listening. He put in a lot of effort in getting this working, and we're evolving to have something that works more or less out of the box. But I'll come back to it. So what you need software, you need funds, you need capital, you need DAI for flip and flop auctions, you need MKR for flap. Because of the recent lot size increase, these capital requirements are a bit bigger, and more capital that you have, it means more simultaneous auctions you can participate in. You need also ETH for gas, of course. Don't underestimate it. Make sure your keeper has enough funds to pay for its transactions. You need an parity node. Right now we have some dependencies on some parity specific functions that are not available on Infura or Get, so make sure you have an Infura node. You also need a gas station API token, not gas station, but yeah, you need an API token for gas pricing strategy, and you need to come up with your strategy script, which we call the pricing model. So basically, pricing model decides when the keeper wins and at which price. So what's new is the Dockerized auction keeper. So basically, the goal is to have something that more or less self-contained. It comes with a default pricing model, a default bidding strategy, more or less. You still need to provide your parity node, your API keys, and so on. But it speeds up the initial configuration, so you can get something done working very quickly, but it's not optimal. If everyone uses the same default piece of software, well, everyone will bid on the same auctions at the same price, and your keeper won't be very competitive. So use the Dockerized auction keeper to get going, so you get something bidding, you have something going on, but then refine it, try to find an edge somewhere to be able to win auctions at better prices and get a auction keeper that will be profitable. Things to consider. Ethereum nodes will often limit the pending transactions for specific addresses. So if you have a lot of DAI to bid and you're trying to bid on multiple auctions at the same time, well, you won't be able to send more than, you won't be able to have more than 50 pending transactions, and after that it will start dropping. That was a problem for some keepers on last Thursday. So to alleviate that, there's a new sharding functionality in the auction keeper where you can use multiple accounts, you fund multiple accounts, and you can bid and participate to auctions from multiple different accounts. Also, make sure you adapt your strategy for the 6-hour auction duration. Your bidding strategy should take into account the remaining time of the auction. And in some cases, we had to report from keepers that had trouble with the resources on server and node. So consider there's a configuration possible that will not kick new auctions. It will only participate on existing auctions. And that's something that is much less resource intensive. So sorry for the very, very quick presentation. Might have time for a few quick questions before we move on to, I go back to you, Vamsi, after, and later I think we have a demo presentation of the auction keeper.
I have a quick question for you, Marc, or Marc Andre. You mentioned the strategies that are built into this, and that implies that people would be using this for profit motive. But what if there was an altruistic user that wanted to get engaged with the system and all they wanted to do was ensure that no zero bids went through, or that they wanted to delay the possibility of lowball bids? Is there a strategy for that?
Yeah, yeah, so basically the bidding strategy determines at what price the auction keeper is ready to win the auction. So if you want to be altruistic, you can go with the market price, or even not higher if you're very altruistic. But usually usually keeper will try to do, well, when auctions work well, auction keepers usually win by a few percentage point below market price, and that's perfectly fine.
Is there a version of this Keeper software that's read only, basically for just surfacing information on pending auctions, and that you could then, rather than actually submitting you having your own pricing model and all that, that's submitting transactions, it's more just for watching what's going on?
I'm not sure. I haven't seen one, but I can't imagine it will be difficult to that. Maybe Chris Mooney that is on the call, I think he experimented with something like that, or maybe not. But I'm not aware of such configuration.
There are also a couple like community-based things that are like front ends that monitor that kind of stuff pretty actively, like DAI auctions.
Yes.
That you can use, but if you want something that's actually on a script running on a node, I don't think there is anything like that right now. Although I have thought about dabbling into that space a bit. If there's enough demand for it, I could try to spin something up.
Cool, thanks.
I just wanted to make a quick note on the last slide of Marc Andre's great presentation. The last point was that if you wanted to lower your node and server constraint, you would pass in a bid-only argument. I'm happy to say that the recent GitHub commit actually includes that by default, and so we assume that anyone using that Docker instance does not have the node or server resources required for a scaled Keeper operation. So just wanted to give you all an update on that.
Okay, yeah, thank you for the update. Very good point.
And Mark, one more thing. You mentioned that there was a demo of the Keeper. I know that the guys are working on getting a recording of it. Is it safe to say that I could get the recording and put it in a link to the summary? It's going to be available for public.
Yeah, I think it will be. Yeah, I think the new recording, we made sure that it includes only public information and things we can share. Yeah.
All right, cool.
All right, cool. Thanks a lot for that presentation. If there are any potential auction keepers listening in, then definitely reach out. Okay, so then sorry to continue to shift gears so quickly, but let's talk a little bit more about the flop auctions. So Vamsi gave us a presentation of how they work. I believe currently they're scheduled to begin 10:30 a.m. Eastern on this Thursday, but that is actually subject to change if as the system accrues more surplus, potentially through further liquidation penalties, that time could be pushed further backwards. So a few days ago, the auctions were scheduled to start, I think, at 6:30 on Thursday, and then due to yesterday's surge in liquidation penalties, it kind of on the accounting side of the system, it clears out some of the earlier chunks of bad debt, and so the auctions, as a result, get pushed back a little bit. One of the questions that keeps popping up over and over again, I think is definitely worth kind of a more in-depth conversation, is the starting price for the flop auction. So currently the auction is structured such that it offers a 250 lot of MKR for 50,000 DAI, and this translates into a price of 200 DAI per MKR. And right now the USD price, while illiquid, has been hovering right around that $200 range for the past 3 or 4 days. It keeps kind of bouncing above and below. So first I want to talk a little bit about how that 200 number was chosen at the beginning. So back in November, when we were initializing parameters for the launch of MCD, one of the considerations that goes into the flop auctions is that presumably if there's a huge crash in collateral prices and the system racks up debt, there could potentially be a crisis of confidence in the price of DAI, and the DAI price might start to waver, and things might get a little hairy. So as a result, the flop auctions should be structured in such a way that the bad debt is cleared out of the queue as soon as possible, really. So that was originally why the flop auctions started. Were scheduled to start 48 hours after bad debt is accrued, and then the price. So back when those parameters were chosen, I think MKR was trading roughly around the $600 range, and so roughly a 2/3 discount was built in as something sensible for what might be a post-crisis MKR price. And it's kind of coincidental how closely that estimate matched up with reality. But now we're actually in a situation that so there's two things. One is that we did not see that crisis of confidence in DAI. In fact, the DAI price has been extremely strong ever since Thursday. This reflects the community's belief that Maker's long-term prospects are fine, and so there isn't really this urgency to clear out that bad debt, as so long as it just gets taken care of eventually. And so that's partly why the extension from 48 hours to 6.5 days was suggested. But now there's a case where if the MKR price is below that 200 starting bid, we may see no bids. And if that were to happen, the entire auction cycle would be pushed back 72 hours or 3 days. And the price would, in the first 3 days, the price would drop from 200 to 166 DAI per MKR. So now the question is, do we want to intervene through governance with that starting bid price to potentially save us 3, or for all we know, 6 or 9 days, hopefully no longer than that? Or does the community want to just kind of keep it as is? There's an argument to be made that even if the spot price is below 200 due to illiquidity concerns, the auction that can still clear just fine, given that it's roughly 5 million and change of MKR to be purchased. That's not really a reasonable amount to buy at spot price on any exchanges right now, as far as I can tell. But certainly there have been plenty of questions about using an executive vote to basically either increase the lot size or decrease the bidding amount, such that the starting price is decreased a bit.
Has there been any thought to reducing the reinitialization delay, or is there a good reason we shouldn't do that?
That's a good question. No, I can't say that there has been much thought put into that, but that's definitely something that we can discuss as well. So if the maximum auction duration, potentially the pricing parameters could stay the same, but the auction duration may be reduced to, say, 2 days or 1 day. And then if the price was, not optimal, then it would only take a day or so to recycle. That's actually an interesting idea. So certainly from a governance friction perspective, doing nothing is just the easiest, right? To not have to rally a 4th executive vote on short notice in the last week. But I think this comes down to a price of kind of a liquidity analysis of, is there a huge, will there even be a huge difference in the debt auction if the starting price is 200 versus 150, given that the public exchange spot price of 200 isn't really very meaningful when dealing with a quantity of 5 million DAI worth of MKR.
Can you speak to some of the risks associated with each option, Cyrus? Like if we just allow the price discovery to occur over the course of a week, what does it expose the ecosystem to?
I think it's maybe just, as far as I can tell, it's primarily branding, optics, having that debt sit in the queue for longer than anybody would like. If the 200 starting bid price is too high for the keepers, then they'll simply just wait 3 days. And you know, there obviously some annoyance and friction on the keeper side as well. Just introduces a bit of uncertainty to the whole situation. There's certainly no there's no issue with doing an executive vote and lowering the bid price, but then it's a question of how much. Do you reduce it to 150 to 100? Should we just reduce it to $1 and just keep it there? One of the original motivations for this minimum bid price was that we well, I'm kind of speculating here, but I think the idea was that we don't want somebody to basically zero bid the debt auction and say, I want $1 trillion MKR for $0. And then if there was a liquidity crisis, all of a sudden MKR is diluted like crazy. That being said, I don't know. It's hard to say, right? Like kind of the free market approach says started at 0 and just let the keeper community do its thing. But for better or worse, that tool is already, that minimum bid tool is here, and the community has to wrangle with it one way or another.
Emiliano has a question in the sidebar. Can we reduce the time between failed auctions instead? Or lower the time between price discovery?
Yeah, I think reducing the time between failed auctions is similar to just the idea of lowering the maximum auction duration to 1 or 2 days.
Are they actually the same parameter? I'm not sure I understand that correctly. Like,
yeah, so a failed auction would be an auction that has no bids, right?
yeah,
so if the auction has no bids, it just resets after 3 days.
Yeah, so the reinitialization delay and maximum auction duration are the same thing. Is that
right? Right.
Okay. Yeah, cool.
Well, we have a lot of stakeholders in the call, and I'm sure that some people here are interested in joining those auctions. And so I'd be interested in hearing if they feel comfortable with offering some suggestions, because we're in this unique situation where we have the actual stakeholders of this parameter available to us. I don't want to put anybody on the spot, but if you have any thoughts, this would be the time to get that out there.
Hey, Rich, this is Charlie from Paradigm. I think we agree with Cyrus's point on the optics of probably being preferable for the auction to clear without needing to wait 3 days for the price reduction. I mean, obviously, you know, in an ideal world, it kind of just gets done cleanly and there aren't any questions raised. I could also see there being some anxiety or negative reaction, worry by the community, you know, through that period that it's not clearing, especially like it just kind of starts that way. So I think we'd be marginally supportive of, you know, changes to add like a margin of safety to the minimum bid price, like Cyrus suggested, or reducing that time to, you know, the starting price going down from 3 days, but those aren't super strong feelings. Yeah, it doesn't seem critical, but it could make sense to us primarily for the optics reason and just trying to get this to clear out as cleanly and quickly as possible.
Guys, do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So to be honest, I see a price reduction are very interesting opportunities for speculators. I mean that you create a precedent. I mean that if we do an executive rotation for reducing to 150, why not reducing to 100? Because I mean, any speculator can short Maker, maybe selling, dropping the price, and then we should take another executive vote to lower the price because we may be scared. And along to that, we know that we already have, in some sense, some sort of protection thanks to the backstop syndicate that is willing to buy at 100. So lowering the price could have an effect also on that side. And this means for me that if we take a decision to lower the price, to reduce the price, also the backstop syndicate could take the same decision. From external parties, there could be communities or maybe speculators. This could be a not so good signal and an opportunity for speculators. So for me, a good idea be reducing the time between failed actions in a way that we can react fastly. So everything that could allow to be more agile in this sense would help. But changing the price, I can understand that the context when the price was chosen was when the Maker was higher and so on. But lowering in a situation when we already have issues, it's not a good signal. I mean that every signal that could represent us much stronger would help, because you see, there are so many speculators that can get this opportunity. So this is my idea.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. If we lowered it to something like 150 or 100, then we could, we could be there in a day. And then what? And then what? Do we have to push it back again? Right? There really isn't a good rationale for any minimum price. And then so, does that mean maybe we should just then if we were to lower it, it probably should just be lowered to $1. But then if we lower it to $1, we run that massive inflation risk with DAI liquidity problems and network congestion, and then it really increases the incentive for an attack, where if somehow people could scurry away with $1 MKR, 5 million of them, right? That would be a huge issue. Now, I know kind of some of the some people feel that that's fine because it's, I guess, I don't know, more free market approach. I personally don't have an opinion, just making sure that everybody balances the pros and cons of this. Yeah, I don't think this is necessarily very easy to come to a conclusion on and get some strong consensus signals on this.
Maybe I can speak briefly on some of our perspective with the backstop syndicate. From at least my perspective, the real risk is if the price of Maker were to fall and a large decentralized group of people were to buy it back up, free market, whatever. But if one highly sophisticated keeper is able to swoop up enough to mount an attack where they can steal collateral or execute malicious upgrades, then that's nail in the coffin. And so as like a community of users that rely on DAI, it's like we're happy to get involved, but it's better if the whole thing doesn't become opened up to these kind of attacks where you can seize a ton of the collateral underlying it. It would just be bad news. So we're basically, regardless of where the auction price starts, 100 DAI for one Maker seems like a really nice shelling point and something that has pretty broad consensus. Now you have you have three categories. You have people that are actually interested in acquiring Maker and would be willing to pay a higher price, to which there's already been discussions of deploying multiple backstop syndicate contracts with different thresholds for if you're more interested in trying to get in at a higher price. Then you have the people that are trying to scalp Maker at very low prices that aren't really interested in the continued health and success of the broader ecosystem, but are really just opportunistic about, yeah, I would buy up a big chunk of this if the price was low enough. And I don't think there's anything wrong with either of those categories of actors. But then this third group is just, we want to just all come together and say, like, I'm willing to pitch in. And if it comes to that. So from the perspective of this backstop syndicate project, I think the idea of auctions that begin higher and then trend down if no one's bidding on them is actually preferable, because it gives the community that doesn't have the sophistication to participate in, or just the capital to participate in the auctions directly as a keeper, it gives them time to review, to share information about it, and to contribute, to enlist in the backstop syndicate, so that we can basically enter the auction if it comes to that on their behalf. And the real goal is not to buy Maker in our case. It's to make sure that all of the Maker gets sold. And if other people are then encouraged to come in at a higher price, that's win-win. So just to give our perspective, like, if the price were to start at $1, the plan would still be to start submitting bids at $100. But I don't think you would see nearly as much participation if that were the case, because everyone would be more interested in trying to get it for $10.
Well, if somebody is already bidding for the MKR for $100, then the next bidder has to offer to take less MKR, which implicitly ups the price of MKR. So once you have a bid, I'm just
there's going to be 100 concurrent auctions at once, unless the backstop syndicate can collect the entire outstanding debt and bid on all of them at 100. Then it would make more sense to then spread it out across all the different auctions, hope you win some. It becomes much more sort of game theoretic, and that's not the intention of this. It's to really signal support for the DAI ecosystem and help prevent a huge chunk of Maker being sold off at potentially very low prices and centralized in a few hands. But obviously, we'll go with whatever direction we decide in this this process. We'll make it work and figure it out. But yeah, I do think that it doesn't make a lot of sense from an optics perspective to have nobody bidding at a price that's unrealistic. If the illiquid nature of the spot market right now for Maker is not accurate, then a reduction makes sense. The thing that worries me about a reduction in the time that the auctions run is that unless the TTL kept getting pushed out, then they could be compressed into too short of a window. In general, that pretty much sums up my personal perspective, at least.
So another interesting idea, just another parameter that we've overlooked is the step size in between failed auctions. So right now it's set to 20%. So it would drop the current 200 price down to 166. That could be dropped to say, that could be increased to say 50% or 100% even. And then the price would just drop in half every 3 days. And so just more aggressively lower the bid price. just another idea.
Actually, it makes sense to me. Like if we like half it.
Would 100% make it 0, or no? I think it would double it, right?
Yeah, it would double
Yeah, it would double.
the make a lot in half. Yeah.
I mean, the risk is you want your keepers to be able to recapitalize. If they really want to buy this, they might be stuck in other auctions. So going down to 50, they may not be able to recapitalize to buy more in that time. So I think 20 is actually a decent parameter because it doesn't allow too much slippage. I don't know about the 3 days though. There's a lot of chatter in the sidebar. I don't know, does anyone want to try and articulate that? And it seemed like Q had a position. Anyone, do you want to speak up? And
Nick, do you want to read out your comment?
Sure. I just kind of wanted to mention that, like, you know, changing the auction model right now substantially is not really feasible, right? Like, smart contracts is not something that you just kind of whip up on an Adderall binge overnight and then, you know, send off to an auditor and they come back the next day and now you deploy it. So we kind of, this is kind of the constraints that we have right now is the current auction model. And I think it would be like much more productive to talk about, okay, well, what are the parameters that we can change, right? We can change the starting price. We can change the auction duration. We can control when it starts and focus on those because that's really the matter at hand that we're trying to deal with here. And that any discussion about, oh, well, we should change to this type of auction model or this other thing, I think that's a great discussion to have, but for the future, not for now. So let's kind of stay focused here.
Just to clarify, I mean, I haven't been reading the side chat, but most of the discussions we've been having verbally have just been simple parameter tweaks, correct?
Yeah, it's been cropping up more in the sidebar.
The side chat has been full of alternative auction ideas, and I think that's great. Just probably not the best for this call.
Right.
So it sounds like the priority is to not have the first round of flop auctions need to get reinitialized, right? So would it make sense to perhaps like the day before they're supposed to go out, I know they're supposed to go out on the 19th on Thursday, the day before, since we have a 4-hour GSM, we could vote on like maybe 20 or like some percentage below whatever the current spot price is. I mean, that'll allow for organic price discovery. It'll allow for, yeah, I don't know, for basically those first flops not to be needed to get reinitialized.
Won't someone just dump or short Maker then and force the spot price down because there's only like 2 million liquidity on Uniswap?
Even if they do that, it doesn't really matter as long as there's bidders willing to buy them MKR on the flop. No, because if, well, actually you might be right.
I don't like the idea of relying on a last minute executive vote to pass for something as
that's also a good point. So we know that we have at least minimum bids by the backstop syndicate. Like we have a whole group of people willing to bid at $100 MKR. Maybe we could use that as a benchmark for the starting of the flops.
Yeah, that's nice in theory as well, and I'm sure that's a totally legitimate, incredible bid. But I also don't think we should be tailoring the starting prices to specific keepers for the network, because that just seems something.
But there's competition, isn't there? There's Paradigm, there's Dharma, there's the Backstop Syndicate, and then there's a whole bunch of, I'm sure, a subset of other keepers that are going to be willing to bid. If we start at whatever we know to be the minimum commitment from like public communications.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess I would just hope or think that there's some unbiased way to come up with like a good starting price that's independent of just the whole space of keepers. I don't know. Maybe I'm overthinking it.
I would second that. the proposal of 100 is anchored in the fact that it is significantly below the market price, and that there's not even an intention to be purchasing Maker at 100. It's a willingness to purchase Maker at 100,
right?
If it comes to that. And so, if anything, starting the auctions at 101 would make more sense. But I want to just sort of second that the auctions should not be tailored around that anchoring price. They should be tailored around the market price, the real market price, or at least like what there's sufficient liquidity for, slightly below spot.
All right, so I think at this point I'm going to hand it off to Rich and Long for wisdom, because I think we're at a point where we need some sort of like governance framework here. Because if we're going to do something, I think this needs to be taken to, I mean, in any case, it has to be taken to the forums, and potentially a governance poll for something as significant as this as well, or else we're just going to be going in circles.
Yeah, and I think that this ties into the things I was touching on at the top of the call. So we have urgency, expediency, agility, all these great issues. But ultimately what this comes down to is what the risks are that are increased by waiting versus the benefits of moving quickly. And so I'm not a risk analyst, and so it's difficult for me to make those kinds of calls. And that's obviously, I should be very careful. It's not my job to make those calls. So I'm just talking out loud right now, right? So my preference would be that, like, obviously this isn't we're all going to die in the next 10 minutes if we don't do something kind of situation. So I would like to follow the process. The process works, right? So let's get a forum post up. Let's put in an explanation of what the situation is. Let's list out the different options. Let's have a debate over the course of the next day or two, and let's put a poll in there, and let's take the next steps. Right? Long, do you have any different opinion?
Yeah, no, I pretty much agree. Like, sorry, so we essentially need what we had before. We need a description of what the parameters are that we can change, what the trade-offs are between changing each ones, and then we can start to move towards, like, change.
Presumably, we have a comfortable, comparatively comfortable situation in that we have, like, what, days to figure this out, Cyrus? Like, what would be the preferred timeline here for some kind of resolution?
I think if a forum post today, I think a governance poll tomorrow, but with an expectation that any sort of executive vote simply may not pass in time, and that everybody should be cognizant of that.
Well, that's ominous. What do you mean that isn't going to pass in time?
Well, I mean, let's say the governance poll reflects community's desire for a change, but the change is not ratified in time, then the current auction parameters are going to be stuck with.
We can't guarantee it, but like the previous ones we've seen have been fairly prompt. Like, maybe as long as we get it up like a day before, we probably should. Like, unless like the parameters, people actually disagree with the parameter changes, like we should be fine.
There's a technical risk here too. If we do end up changing the parameters, it changes like bidding model strategies, keepers are getting ready. I would definitely not allow an executive, if I were governance, I would not allow an executive to chain into the middle of the auctions and all of a sudden change those parameters out from underneath all the keepers.
Good point. That is something which I've probably written down in the forum post.
Yeah, here's another, like, nothing in governance is easy. So here we have a cadence, right? And there's other decisions to be made, and potentially, like, there's other cleanup issues, there's other tweaking, there's the normal Friday vote that we have coming. How are we going to roll all this stuff up? Are we going to have an executive every day until we're out of the woods? So there's cognitive and governance overhead that needs to be considered as well. So I think that here's the summary. As always, governance needs to happen in the forum, and we don't make protocol level decisions in these calls. We just set some direction that we hash out in the forums in text with everybody having the opportunity to follow along with that discussion. So we understand what the question is. We understand what the protocol is. We don't understand the timing. We don't understand the reasoning. We don't understand the urgency or the options available to us, but that's what the forum is for. So Cyrus, I'm actually going to refoist your valiant effort to foist onto us. So let's work together after the call to get that forum post up and running, and then we'll hash out as a community urgency and the impact on various actors.
Okay, sounds good. Let's.
I think the USDC is probably going to be the main topic.
Yeah. Let's. I agree. We should move on. I was going to talk about SCD for a bit, but we can kick that to the end, or maybe. Did you say we're having these calls daily, Rich? And if so,
yeah. Well, I think so. There's going to be no shortage of things to talk about, right? So until morale improves, these calls will continue.
All right. So I want to talk about USDC and circuit breakers together because they're a little bit intertwined. And then afterwards, we can look at some statistics and run through some of the numbers of what was actually minted last night. But in the last 4 or 5 days, we've had the liquidation freeze, or circuit breakers, as I like to call them, USDC collateral, and Thursday night, we also passed that executive vote to increase the bid duration to 6 hours. It's been a lot that's been going on, obviously. And as a result, there have been a few pretty big misconceptions. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about these three new governance actions and how they all kind of fit together. So just super brief recap. This isn't any sort of post-mortem, but basically on Thursday, there were two main issues that we were dealing with. One was network congestion, and the other one was DAI liquidity. And I don't feel that we've really had a chance to properly discuss these two issues and how they interrelate with each other. The basic idea is that the increase in the TTL that was passed Thursday night was primarily to hedge Maker against network congestion. So obviously keepers were struggling to get bids out. They were struggling with node infrastructure and all sorts of Ethereum protocol related things. And that 6 hour delay gives keepers the time to take care of those issues. But very critically, what this 6 hour TTL change did not give us was a proper solution to the DAI liquidity issue. So I'm going to do a very quick screen share. All right, so this is one of my favorite new Maker stats tools made by the one and only Vishesh. And this chart here in the middle, this is a representation of how much DAI debt will be liquidated at different price points for ETH. And so just like hovering over some of these numbers, if ETH gets to say 80, then 6 million, around 6 million DAI will need to be bid on by keepers. If the price hits 70, gets to 11 million. Around a price of 60, it's starting to get a little scary. 26 million DAI that keepers will have to come up with. And at a price of 55 or lower, that says 55 million DAI. These numbers are no joke. And this was like in my opinion, this is a very serious risk that wasn't properly processed by the community in the context of some of the changes that we passed over the last few days. 1 second. Right. So first point that I want to make sure we all agree with, or maybe we don't, but the TTL, the bid duration, whether it's 10 minutes or 6 hours or 24 hours, it doesn't really affect the auction keeper liquidity crisis. If the price hits, you know, in that 50 to 60 handle, just a personal gut feeling, keepers are not going to be able to raise 50 million DAI. It's just one of those really tricky things, right? And it's also important to remember that this isn't a function of exchange liquidity for ETH as a collateral type. So even if Uniswap and all the DEXs and all the centralized exchanges in Coinbase could likely properly handle 50, $60 million worth of ETH within a 33% slippage buffer, it's really the DAI liquidity that's the issue here. So, you know, quick solutions were needed last several days. The basic premise was to slow down the rate of liquidations were they to occur. So ideally, so for example, 20 million of collateral was going to go up for sale. Some sort of mechanism where it could be liquidated in, say, $5 million chunks and the goal of this is that keepers could have the ability to essentially recycle the DAI that they are using to bid on auctions. So just making a number up, let's say keepers have in total, they have, say, 10 million DAI at their disposal. If there's $30 million worth of collateral that needs to be liquidated, they could handle that in 3 cycles if they have a chance to kind of convert their auction proceeds back into more DAI to bid on the next batch. But the current auction format does not allow such a privilege. And so while there clearly is room for long-term changes to the auction format, that's something that would take likely months if I had to guess. So I think the first priority was how can we slow down the rate of collateral being liquidated, and I think that was the main impetus behind the liquidation freeze. So essentially, if you have if you can tell based off of the OSM what the next price is going to be, and you have that 1 hour delay, then governance can rally up an executive vote to freeze liquidations. Now, once the liquidations are frozen, there still needs to be a plan in place on how to deal with all that collateral once the liquidations are unfrozen, because the DAI liquidity may not magically surface itself in a day or who knows how long, right? And so that was kind of the impetus behind USDC being as a collateral type, because presumably there is a large set of DeFi ecosystem players that are active in Maker and active in other protocols, and they have large USDC balances, and for whatever reason they're kind of their base stash is not DAI, and it's maybe not even ETH. And if it was ETH, maybe they're too concerned for opening up a vault in that moment. And so adding USDC as a collateral type allows USDC-based keepers to mint DAI and bid on these auctions. Now, yesterday, the DAI price coincidentally happened to also explode up to $1.10. And there was clearly a DAI liquidity crisis in terms of the peg. Certainly adding USDC as a collateral type helps with the DAI peg. And we'll show some data after this that we tracked some of the USDC, some of the DAI that was minted from USDC over the last 12 hours. And a lot of it has gone to kind of helping push the DAI price back down. But we need to be clear that well, at least in my personal opinion, allowing keepers an opportunity to mint DAI for auctions, it was vastly more important than kind of doing a very quick addition of USDC in order to fix the DAI peg. Does that sort of make sense so far? The kind of the distinction between keeper auction liquidity and helping the DAI price.
Silence might mean yes, or it might mean no.
Right. Well, if it's no, I think it's super important to clarify, because it also does have implications on risk parameters for USDC.
Let's assume no, because people are probably, that's what people are going to be afraid to say. So can you just recap briefly your point?
Right. Okay.
Well, maybe actually, Cyrus, maybe I can ask the question. You could tell me if I'm right. So like the circuit breaker is important because it gives a chance for all of these mass liquidations, if they happen, to be parsed out into lots at our discretion so that there's no liquidity crunch, right? And then the addition of USDC allows for keepers who might have USDC in their inventories to leverage that USDC for temporary liquidity to participate in the auctions, which helps with the DAI price because it reduces also the DAI liquidity crunch.
Correct. Yeah, that's exactly it. So let's just also one last time recap the two problems. One is the DAI price, which is going up to, it reached $1.10. But it's a secondary, and in my opinion, more important concern is that if we triggered vault liquidations at an ETH price of 60 or 50, the keepers would be almost certainly overwhelmed, no matter what the auction parameters were. There would be no set of auction parameters that would allow keepers to gather the necessary DAI liquidity to properly bid on those auctions. So there's two tools that were introduced. One was the ability to freeze auctions so that they can be spaced out a little bit more appropriately over time. And the second tool was to allow keepers a source of DAI liquidity through USDC as a collateral type. The fact that keepers are using USDC to help just arb the DAI price downwards is just a positive byproduct. It's just an additional side effect. Now, the reason I say this is important for risk parameters is because obviously there is a lot of discussion in the broader community about having USDC as a collateral type, and some people are potentially unhappy with it. And so the idea is that if we only wanted to target auction keeper liquidity, but not have USDC be kind of a permanent staple of the collateral pool, then you could put like a 1,000% stability fee on USDC, so prohibitively high that on a day-to-day basis, absolutely no one would borrow USDC because it would just make absolutely no sense, except for that one rare instance where the price of ETH does nosedive and an enormous amount of liquidity, an enormous amount of collateral is to be liquidated. And in such a scenario, keepers know that since there's a DAI shortage, that they could earn upwards of, astronomical returns. Something like they could get 50% if they bid well on those auctions. And in those instances, it would make sense to borrow at 1,000% stability fee in a space of 6 hours. So there's ways to kind of straddle the best of both worlds if we're able to properly parse the nuances of having USDC and understanding the liquidation structure and how to use a circuit breaker and so on.
I just want to read this one thing from the chat that Matthew Light wrote for the sake of the recording, but he said it might be worth telling everyone on the call that people can immediately generate USDC from USD on Coinbase with no cost. So the addition of USDC is essentially equal to adding US dollars as collateral.
Cool. Well, just said it. So.
Yep.
So another point was that someone asked if there's any evidence of active keepers with large USDC balances.
Right.
So maybe
And
that's
Cyrus, you mentioned that you guys were tracking some stuff.
Yeah, I'm happy to dive into that now. Given that we're already on the topic of circuit breakers a bit, we can also talk a little bit more about that, but maybe we can do that tomorrow as well if this is kind of too much too soon.
Well, I think we have like half an hour more until we're at the 2-hour mark. So maybe we can just save the SCD shutdown discussion for maybe tomorrow. And today we could really fully cover the topic at hand.
Right. Okay. So let me just finish up kind of one last major topic on the liquidation freeze, which is basically how to even use it. Right. So we have this tool. We have this tool that allows us to freeze liquidations if we see, say, some astronomical amount of collateral that would have to be liquidated. But we don't really have any operational concepts of how this would work. And certainly this will be another forum post for people to discuss because obviously there's a lot to grasp here. But just so that the community is mildly prepared over the short run volatility that might come. So let's run through let's run through another hypothetical example. Let's say the keepers in total have roughly 10 million DAI at their disposal. Possible to know what that number is, but I think within an order of magnitude, that might be like a good ballpark estimate. Price of ETH starts to drop, and it's about to hit, I think, something like $70. I think if the price of ETH were to hit 70, all of a sudden there may be $30 million worth of collateral that will be liquidated. To protect the system, to protect the protocol from losses, keepers would have to bid roughly 2/3 of that amount to protect the system from losses, which is 2/3 of 30 million is 20 million DAI. So if the keepers only have 10 million DAI, but there's 20 million that they need to come up with, then the system will almost certainly suffer an additional 10 million DAI loss. And so one potential option would be for the keepers to send some sort of signal to the community and say, hey, governance community, if you guys can freeze liquidations, then we can potentially run through, we could, okay. So I didn't set the context up properly. That's my bad. So this is sufficiently confusing, and maybe I'll just send this to a forum post.
I've got a slide or two. I've got 2 slides actually that talk about circuit breakers at a really high level. So maybe like operationally, I can introduce that if people are cool with that.
No, it's not so much an operational detail as it is like almost more like a trading strategy. So, okay, sorry, apologies community. Let me briefly start over. Let's say that ETH price drops to 80. It triggers 10 million of liquidations. The keepers spend they use their 10 million for the auctions. And then the price then drops to say 80, and you have another 10 million of liquidations on its way. The keepers can then send a signal to the community and say, hey, governance community, if we had time to get our 10 million DAI back from the round of auctions that was just initiated, we can happily bid on this next set of liquidations as well. But currently our DAI is tied up in the previous round of auctions. So at that point, governance can run an executive within the space of an hour to freeze that second set of liquidations. This would allow keepers enough time to essentially recycle their DAI, at which point liquidations would be unfrozen and they could handle the second set. All right, I'm going to do a forum post on this. This is, I can understand that this is quite confusing. Any last questions before we jump into some USDC statistics?
I would just mention as well, a couple of people mentioned that they wanted to discuss SED as well. So maybe we do open time for that. Or
yeah, we'll do that. We'll do that afterwards. Primoz, are you on the call to show some of that?
Sure.
Okay, just a second. Okay. So last week was really active in terms of SCD migration activity. One of the most active weeks actually this year. Pretty much for the same reasons that happened on MCD. I'm going to explain it later on. But the size supply dropped for 4.5 million. DAI SAI migration contract dropped for only about 2.5 million, which means there was also a high increase of SAI flowing into migration contract. We also had some liquidations, but not as many as in MCD, and that's primarily because quotation ratio at SCD was historically much higher than an MCD, so we didn't see so much liquidations happening. So here is just an overall view of CDP repayment activity. As I said, about 4.7 million was repaid and also liquidated. About 170 CDPs actually repaid or were liquidated in last week. And you can see here the jump in the activity. So this is the CDP migration activity, and you can see that's on 13th of March, Friday, one day after the Thursday when it crashed. A lot of CDPs just migrated over to MCD. So why was this happening? So I have two ideas. Probably the first one was historically, or in the last few weeks, they were defending against CDPs were defending against getting liquidated by depositing additional Ether. Now it sort of seemed that they kind of capitulated. They didn't want, to have this long exposure. And if you want to close your CDP, the only way out is actually to migrate to MCD, and then you can close your vault. So I'm guessing this was one of the reasons why they actually migrated in such a hurry after a few weeks of pretty much no activity or little activity. And the second reason might be that how SCD works is a bit different than MCD. It could be they were afraid of seeing bad losses in SCD system, which would dilute the pooled Ether, which they hold as collateral, which means they basically need to bear this loss themselves, so CDPs. And this could also be, as I said, this reason that they hurried a bit and they got scared. And that's why we saw this high activity of migration. And I've always said that the falling Ether should be the one that actually makes them migrate over. So the falling Ether price, because they have less flexibility in SCD. They can only deposit additional Ether or they need to migrate it if they want to lower the exposure. They also paid some significant amount of interest. I'm still running the calculations there, but my estimation is around 300,000. but it's actually a combination of penalty fees and interest rates, interests. And of course, penalty fees are not the ones which are collected by Maker system. It's collected again by pooled Ether holders, yeah, and interests about 200,000, I guess, were actually paid to the Maker system. Here you can see also on the SAI holder side, they were also very active. They also migrated on those 2 days very heavily. I think I have the activity here. So here is the SAI flowing into migration contract. Again, a spike on Thursday. And what may be a reason for that? I was thinking this might be because if you have SAI, there's SAI is trading over one. Of course, there's a premium, but if you want to sell 1 million SAI, you don't really get a buyer because one who is buying is most likely CDP, and he can, you know, get SAI liquidity in migration contract for $1. Here SAI holders would most likely want to migrate to DAI and then collect the premium that was available, which was, I think it's almost 13%. So this might be one of the reasons that also forced, and this liquidity crunch forced SAI holders to go to MCD, to DAI, and then sell it. Or they might be, you know, just depositing DAI on secondary markets because the rates also shoot up to, I think, 17% at Compound, 45, 40 at DYDX. So yeah, these were I'm guessing the reasons why we saw such a high activity in SCD last week. I want to say this, there are still bites that were happening today. Actually, not bites. Bites were already made, but people were not really bidding. This was most probably because in SCD you have 3% discount, and of course both SAI and DAI were trading well over $1, and nobody was really incentivized to close those auctions. Until today, I saw most of that bites getting cleared, but we still have few CDPs who have liquidation ratio actually lower than 150%. You can see the breakdown here, and are not getting beaten at all. I'm guessing this will happen very soon when DAI and SAI, mostly DAI, goes back to $1, and again the liquidators have this incentive to bid with 3% discount. Another thing I want to mention is Cyrus showed, you know, how much debt gets liquidated in MCD if price drops. In SCD, the situation might be a bit better, but then when it goes down to $60, for instance, we saw in MCD you have 25 million of liquidations, which is, I think that's a bit more than 1/3 of MCD debt, but here you basically get most of the debt actually wiped at this price, which is a problem. So up to 80, 70, it's less problem because there is SAI liquidity in migration contract, currently at, I'm guessing 3.8 million. But then if price starts dropping, you'll have a SAI liquidity crunch, and the situation might get really bad for SCD as well. Just last two things. There were discussions when we should shut down SCD. There were some polling made on forums. I think the votes that won were 10 million SAI, and I think 6 months duration, and if the peg deviates by more than 5%. I checked how much SAI supply is inactive. This number really doesn't move, so it seems like holders who've been holding SAI for more than 6 months, there's 10 million of holdings there of SAI, and they don't move at all, right? So even this premium that they could earn in the last week wasn't enough actually to move the SAI to MCD and, you know, earn extra yield there on selling it with a high premium. So it seems like this is like the lower bound, and it somehow coincides with this 10 million that was signaled on forums. And then on the CDP side, the CDPs that were inactive during the migration, the number dropped a bit from, I think, 12 million to 10 million, but we're still seeing, you know, one large CDP who doesn't do nothing, and then few larger ones as well. Hard to say when they'll be incentivized to migrate or to close the position, especially because they have a lot of room. I think the biggest one has liquidation ratio here. It's 60 Ether, $60 Ether price. So just to conclude, what I believe might happen further is that if Ether price drops again, we might probably see the same thing happening again. So increased migration activity and migration activity of both Psi and CDPs. But if Ether rebounds or is kind of stays here at these levels, I'm guessing we're going to see less activity, pretty much similar that we saw in the last few weeks, just a small decline maybe in size supply, in my opinion.
And also just to point out, I think the situation for keeper liquidity is even worse in SCD than MCD, because at least in MCD, we now have the USDC collateral type and the ability to freeze the liquidations if necessary. But if the price drops, all these massive size CDPs will be underwater, and they will pretty much never get bitten, because the keepers will just never be able to come up with the necessary liquidity. And at this point, this becomes a fairly dangerous situation for the PETH holders. Yeah,
agree. The limit is in this migration contract, so to say. So this is the buffer we kind of have now.
Cyrus, I've observed a very, I think it's logical during the last week, because due to the liquidity of DAI mostly, we've seen like a quite linear relationship between the increase in the DAI price and actually the moments where the ETH was actually dropping, right? And I'm actually wondering whether through the addition of the collateral of USDC and the increase in the liquidity there, that relationship would then kind of flatten out a little bit more going into the future. I don't know if this is an observation that anyone has made in the past, but there's quite a linear relationship between those two.
Is this related to the SCD discussion, or could we maybe do this after for the Q&A?
Yeah, it's kind of related to the SCD discussion in the sense that one of the reasons for migrations that Primož has just mentioned was actually that premium that actually the people actually could get on DAI, on the 13% or so that it was actually mentioned there. And I say, actually, if then the PAG goes to a normal level, then I guess potentially that reason for migrating actually reduces itself. It's kind of like, it's an observation on that relationship, but also like a question whether we have thought about this. Yeah. Do you want me to rephrase?
No, I mean, I think, yeah, I certainly think that that relationship exists.
Yeah, because at the moment, or at least over the last week, almost kind of that increase in the DAI price is almost a linear, like linear to the ETH drop. So if you want, anyone who would doing just like a basic logistic regression there would actually basically say, actually, that's a predictor. That's a predictor of ETH price dropping at the moment as it stands right now. And I'm actually wondering whether going to the future with the reduction, with the increase of the liquidity that will be allowed by USDC as a collateral, then we may see less of that incentive for people to migrate into DAI from Sai.
Yeah, that's an interesting point then. If the DAI price is better managed due to the additional collateral types, then the Sai and DAI price might start to deviate from each other, and Sai might be more volatile and rally harder on the ETH side.
That's right, because we've seen that relationship stands right now with DAI and ETH. And in the future, if we kind of like, okay, we flatten out on the DAI side, then actually Sai start actually deviating in that direction.
Yeah, I think generally speaking, the SCD situation is not great, and I would hope that governance finds a way to kind of responsibly manage what's left of SCD, because I think expectations for a graceful wind down at this point, based with having the side peg come back to 1 and getting significantly more migration out of what's left, might be difficult. Additionally, balancing that risk to path holders as well, who I think at the depths of it on Thursday, certain size CDPs were below the 100% collateralization threshold and still did not get bitten because of the fixed discount. So another situation like that would just lead to spiraling losses for path holders. So I really want to increase the urgency on some SCD governance. That's
well, just to touch on that real quick. So it's not just a pass problem. Like there are currently still some small CDPs that haven't been bitten and are still under collateralized, and there's still last I checked a fair amount of path to be sold sitting in the contract. I forget the exact name of the contract, but in the SCD contract that collects collateral after bytes, there's a bus transaction that goes through, which is the actual sale, but at least as of this morning, a fair amount of that was not sold yet. Okay, I am seeing that it looks like it actually just recently cleared, so never mind.
Also, just wanted to insert one other point, a bit out of order, about USDC, but I don't know if it was covered, but I know I just wanted to make sure that this was out there, that what is it? Sorry, one second. That the CAT, it doesn't have authority on the USDC flippers, so USDC liquidations aren't actually possible without another executive vote that enables them. So just wanted to throw that. I don't know if it was already mentioned earlier during the USDC section of the call.
That's a great point, David. No, I don't think that was mentioned. So yeah, in the forum post yesterday, or for the executive vote, it mentioned that the USDC collateral type was initialized with liquidations frozen, such that even the accrual of stability fees at this time would not lead to liquidated vaults.
I want to take this opportunity to do a little bit of a gut check. So we're coming up to the 2-hour mark. It's busy days. We have a lot of things to discuss, and I don't want to get necessarily locked into an never-ending governance call when there's forum posts to be made and polls to be written and actions to be taken. So Cyrus, were there other beats that you wanted to hit specifically for this call, or can
maybe just one last one?
Okay.
One last one. Give me 1 sec.
Sure. While you're using your sec, we'll have continual, like I said at the top, we're going to have these calls tomorrow and the next day and probably the next day and the day after that. So this is not the only window for debate. So if you had a question you didn't feel was explored adequately, or you want to revisit this topic conversation, either consider adding that to a forum thread and putting it in your back pocket, and we'll add it to the agenda tomorrow for tomorrow's call. All right, Cyrus.
Right. So just some super brief early analysis on the DAI backed by USDC. You can see in this column here under activity that pretty much a lot of it is being used for arbitraging the DAI price back down. That's all. So I mean, just wanted to highlight that a lot of it is going to various dexes. This kind of just ties back into the original point where USDC should, I think the primary value it brings to the Maker ecosystem is that it allows keepers liquidity for auctions, and it may be undesirable for day-to-day peg management. If that is kind of the consensus case, then the stability fee could be dramatically increased such that we don't see DAI usage for peg arbitrage and only for keeper liquidity. But also, I think, of course, in the short run, these are definitely benefits right now as well. They just need to be properly balanced against the risks of having somewhat of a perpetual USDC presence in the collateral pool. And we'll try to keep this, we'll try to keep some of this analysis updated over the next few days to try to kind of get a sense of what vault owners are using their DAI for. I mean, it'll be impossible to say whether vault owners will use this for auctions until we see another dramatic decline in the ETH price. So it's a little bit difficult in that sense. Yeah, that's all.
Thanks, Cyrus. So like I said, this is the 2-hour mark. We're going to post the video as soon as Zoom finishes processing, which is can take a while these days. There will be a brief summary as well. It takes a lot of time and energy and resources to transcribe these things, so the summaries might be slightly abbreviated, but we'll catch up in the future if people require them. Otherwise, the video will be up soon. Look to the forums, please, and join the new discussion. Cyrus will have some interesting things for us to consider at the very least. And let's plan to reconvene tomorrow. I've noticed a trend that as soon as the recording stops, the debate gets fairly furious and interesting. So there's a little bit of shyness there. I encourage people to potentially think about that for tomorrow's call, because there's a lot of conversations that we should be having. But in the interest of that, I'm fine with just leaving this call open so people can hang out and stuff. But I'm reasonably sure that there's a number of us that need to get back to work. So.
If somebody wants to keep the call open, switch it to them because I'm going to get off.
All right, cool. So yeah, we have to bounce. Thanks everybody for showing up. Thanks for the presentations. See you in the forums.